Hello again. This is one of about 200 talks that I'm recording on the history of Western art, and this is section 10 on the Renaissance, and it's the first part, the introduction to the Renaissance, a big subject. Now, the Renaissance, of course, was one of the most influential art movements, with artists such as Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael and Titian. So it was hard for me to select which of the many masterpieces to choose. And what I've done is I've tried to choose what I think are the best known, the most well-known works, and use those to represent some of the changes that took place during the Renaissance period. You might be wondering why I've started the talk on the Italian Renaissance with a work from ancient Rome, heavily influenced, of course, by ancient Greece. This is the Laocoon and his sons. It was dug up in Rome in 1506 in a vineyard on the Esquiline Hill, and since then it's become one of the most famous ancient sculptures ever excavated. It was placed on public display in the Vatican, and it's still there. It remains there to this day. So this is to signify the influence of the classical period on the people at the time. But there's a lot more influences and factors that converged to create the Renaissance, which literally means rebirth. First of all, there was a decline of feudalism, rise of city-states in Italy, the creation of a wealthy merchant class that patronised the arts, fostering an environment where individual achievement and personal success were valued. Then there was the rediscovery and translation of ancient Greek and Roman texts, which reintroduced classical knowledge to Europe and sparked a renewed interest in humanism, human potential and self-expression. In 1453, there was the fall of Constantinople, and that led to an influx of Greek scholars and manuscripts to Italy. That further fueled this intellectual revival. Then in the middle of the 15th century, there was the invention of the printing press, and that was a major change because it allowed the rapid dissemination of ideas. Then, of course, in the 16th century, there was the Protestant Reformation, which challenged the authority of the Catholic Church and promoted this idea of a personal relationship with God, further emphasising individual faith. And then, of course, the Black Death's aftermath led to increased social mobility, economic opportunities, particularly in Western Europe. And all these factors coming together at the same time or over the same couple of 100-year period set the stage for the Renaissance. And I thought I'd start with this work by Giotto di Bondone, a 14th century artist that took art in a new direction. This pre-Renaissance, sometimes called proto-Renaissance period, began with the work of artists like Cimabue and Giotto, and with the literature of Dante and Plutarch and Boccaccio. This, what we're looking at now, is the Sistine Chapel in Padua, and is the work of Giotto, arguably the father of the Renaissance. Incidentally, I apologise for the quality, but it was my handheld phone in panoramic mode, and visitors only get 20 minutes in the chapel after passing through and waiting in an airlock. But this work, you can see, I think, shows the characteristics of the Renaissance: realism and naturalism. Artists strived for accurate depictions of the human form, of nature and the surroundings, and using techniques like linear perspective and chiaroscuro. And there was a renewed focus on the individual and the celebration of human potential. And it was inspired as well by ancient Greek and Roman art. So linear perspective was developed and refined and used to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface. Oil painting increasingly replaced tempera, and that allowed for an unprecedented detail and luminosity. And then new oil painting techniques were developed, like sfumato and chiaroscuro, to give a sense of depth and volume in paintings. Religious images were still prominent, but were depicted with more naturalism and emotion. There was an increased focus on individual portraiture, including self-portraits. And artists increasingly depicted classical myths and historical events. Art expanded beyond the church to include wealthy individuals and families, and artists became elevated from mere craftsmen to intellectuals and even creative geniuses. So the Renaissance represents a rebirth of classical learning and values, and it was combined with innovative techniques, a new emphasis on the individual and realism, and it laid the foundation, of course, for much of Western art that followed. Now, the image we are looking at here is the end wall of the Sistine Chapel and represents the Last Judgment. I won't go into detail in this talk because it's an overview of the whole of the Renaissance, but above we can see Christ sitting in a rainbow-coloured mandorla representing his role as judge, and below is the Last Judgment, and on the left of the cross is the patron, Enrico Scroveni, along with a tonsured man. We're not sure who he is. It might be a local Augustinian friar, and Scroveni is presenting a model of the chapel. You can see that building he's holding to three female figures thought to be the three Marys. And on the right is Satan. Let me show you an enlargement of that part of the picture. And his minions torturing damned souls, often, as you can see, in sexually perverse ways, adding a disturbing element to the judgment scene, a startling representation of the vices. But also in the chapel, there's the corresponding virtues. It's a very carefully thought out scheme around the chapel, and the chapel as a whole represents a significant development in Western art. Let me show you one other fresco from the chapel. This is a well-known work, The Kiss of Judas. It shows Judas Iscariot identifying Jesus to the Roman soldiers with a kiss, which led to the arrest of Jesus. And Giotto's approach captures the emotional drama of the moment. The two figures are locked in a striking confrontation. Judas is the one with the yellow cloak, symbolising deceit and corruption. There's a chaotic background of soldiers and disciples, contrasting, I think, with the calm yet sorrowful expression of Christ, emphasising his foreknowledge and acceptance of his fate. Just a little bit of background. Giotto was born in 1267 in Vespignano, near Florence, and he's often considered the father of European painting. And according to legend, he was discovered as a shepherd boy by Cimabue, drawing lifelike sheep on a rock. I don't know whether it's true or not. It's a nice story, but he did receive training as an apprentice under Cimabue, and that marked the beginning of his career, which would revolutionise art, moving away from the flat, stylised figures of Byzantine art. Giotto introduced naturalism, emotional depth, and three-dimensionality into his work. One well-known story, referred to as Giotto's O, concerns his skill as a craftsman and draftsman. Giorgio Vasari, recounts how Giotto once drew a perfect freehand circle to demonstrate his talent to Pope Benedict XI, and that earned him a commission in Rome. And there's another story that he painted a fly that was so lifelike on a work that Cimabue was working on. It was so convincing that Cimabue tried to swat it away. Another important early master is Masaccio. This is the tribute money, and it's a groundbreaking fresco in the Brancacci Chapel of Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence. And this painting shows a scene from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus is instructing Peter to find a coin in a fish's mouth to pay the temple tax. And Masaccio ingeniously combines 3 moments of the story into a single composition. You can see the tax collector's demand, Peter retrieving the coin, and the payment. Masaccio was born in 1401 near Florence and was a pivotal figure in the early Renaissance. He died aged only 26, but despite his short life, he brought in many innovations in perspective, chiaroscuro, naturalism, and profoundly influenced later artists. His name, incidentally, is a nickname. It means roughly something like clumsy Tom, because Masso is an abbreviation of his name, which is Tommaso di Giovanni di Simone Casse, and the diminutive ending, accio, Masaccio, means careless or messy, which was a reference to his personal appearance. But despite having this unflattering nickname, his artistic skill was anything but clumsy. He actually included himself. There's a self-portrait of himself in this painting. He's one of the apostles standing at the end of the group. This fresco became a sort of training school for later artists. Even Michelangelo studied and praised this work, recognising its revolutionary nature, and it was an enduring influence over the Renaissance period. Another significant artist is Fra Angelico, and this was a time, it was about this time that Brunelleschi completed the dome of Florence Cathedral. That was between 1420 and 1436. So as well as the developments in art, there were developments in literature, developments in architecture, and so on. Everything was changing. This is one of Fra Angelico's best known works, the Annunciation. It's a fresco painted at the top of the stairs in the convent of San Marco in Florence, and it would have been seen in that position daily by the other friars. The scene depicts the moment when the angel Gabriel announces to the Virgin Mary she will conceive and bear the Son of God. It's notable for its simplicity and serenity. They're both situated in a loggia-like space, opens onto a garden, and an enclosed garden like this is often used to symbolise Mary's purity. Now, Fra Angelico was born Guido di Pietro in 1395, and he became a friar, Dominican friar, in 1418 and took the name Giovanni da Fiesole, later nicknamed Angelico because he was so devout and gentle. And you can see that, I think, that quality of gentleness and in his paintings. He was praised by his contemporaries for his piety and skill. And in fact, let me give you a quote from Vasari from his book, The Lives of the Artists. He wrote, it was impossible to bestow too much praise on this Holy Father, who was so humble and modest in all that he did and said, and whose pictures were painted with such facility and piety." End quote. An interesting anecdote about him relates to his beatification, and although he was informally known as Beato Angelico for centuries, he wasn't actually formally beatified by the Catholic Church until 1982, 500 years after his death, by Pope John Paul. Now, beatification requires either a martyrdom or one miracle, and in this case Pope John Paul pointed to his paintings and said, "These are his miracles." In 1434, the Medici family rose to power in Florence and became major patrons of Renaissance art and culture, and this is Donatello's bronze David, a groundbreaking sculpture depicting a biblical hero, the one who slayed the giant Goliath. And you can see there's David shown as a youthful nude figure standing triumphantly over Goliath's severed head, and David is holding the giant's sword in one hand and a stone in the other, with which he killed him using a sling. Now, Donatello was born in 1386 in Florence and became one of the most influential sculptors of the Italian Renaissance. It's probable that he learnt stone carving while working on Florence Cathedral, and he was later apprenticed to Lorenzo Ghiberti, and this work marked a significant departure from medieval artistic traditions. In fact, it's the first known freestanding nude statue since antiquity. You might be wondering, why is he nude? It's to emphasize his vulnerability, and it contrasts sharply with his massive foe, and it underscores the idea that David's victory came through divine intervention rather than physical strength. And that is why he's shown nude, to emphasize his vulnerability. It's also, the statue was politically significant. The Medici, by associating themselves with David, sought to portray themselves as defenders of Florentine liberty against tyranny. It was commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici in the courtyard of their palace, and it was a bold statement of artistic and political intent. It was in a semi-public setting, and it showed their wealth and their taste and their alignment with humanist ideals at the time. The other aspect of it is that if you look at the face and the pose, there are androgynous aspects, there are feminine features, it's a sensual pose, and it sparked centuries of debate and interpretation. The ambiguity may have been intentional to emphasize David's youth and divine favour. However, it also has led to speculation about Donatello's personal life and sexuality, although of course that's secondary to the work itself. It's worth pointing out at this point that sodomy was potentially a very serious crime, but in Florence alone there were 17,000 men fined for sodomy out of a population of 40,000, and it became known at that time as a tax on sodomy. It was so common. Another anecdote relating to Donatello's work: he was known for his unconventional approach to critiquing his own work. What he would do is he would set up his sculptures in a public place and then hide nearby to overhear honest opinions from passers-by, and then he would use that feedback to refine and develop his art. Piero della Francesca, The Resurrection of Jesus Christ, a fresco masterpiece in the Museo Civico di San Sepolcro. It shows Christ emerging from his tomb. It's a important, pivotal moment in Christian theology because it symbolises his triumph over death. He stands majestically on top of the sarcophagus, holding a banner of victory, while 4 soldiers sleep at the base, unaware of the miracle unfolding. Now, Piero della Francesca was born around 1415 in San Sepolcro and became one of the most influential painters of the early Renaissance for his mathematical precision. He was a mathematician as well as an artist, and this painting exemplifies those qualities. You can see in it his mastery over perspective and his ability to imbue religious scenes with profound sense of dignity and calm. It's rich and multifaceted. The sleeping soldiers represent us, humanity's ignorance of divine mysteries. If you look at the landscape behind either side of Christ, you'll notice it's barren on the left and lush on the right, symbolising the transition from spiritual death to a new life. And the central figure of Christ serves as both a vertical and horizontal axis, creating this perfect balance in the composition, which gives it its calm. Note the impossible pose of one of the guards, the one holding the spear. In order to achieve a more harmonious composition, Piero left the soldier without legs. I mean, you can hardly notice it until you look carefully. And his influence extended beyond painting. I said he was a mathematician. He in fact wrote treatises on geometry and perspective, reflecting the Renaissance ideal of the artist, that the artist is an intellectual, a universal scholar. And then a final point about this painting, which I think is worth mentioning, is that it was almost lost. It was almost destroyed during World War II. But a British artillery officer, Tony Clark, who was aware of the painting and its importance, reportedly disobeyed orders to shell San Sepolcro and therefore save the town and this masterpiece. The story, possibly embellished, it does highlight the enduring and international importance of this work through centuries. Another one of the most famous works of the early Renaissance. This is The Birth of Venus, of course, by Sandro Botticelli. Widely believed to have been commissioned by a member of the Medici family, probably Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de' Medici, who was a cousin and ward of Lorenzo il Magnifico, the Magnificent. Created around the middle of the 1480s. It may have been intended for their villa. And you may wonder why this particular painting was produced. Well, Venus is shown here both as an earthly goddess of physical love and a celestial goddess of intellectual love. And this duality aligned with the teachings of Marsilio Ficino and what's called the Florentine Platonic Academy, which sought to reconcile classical mythology with Christian thought. So what you see here is a work that is combining those two philosophies. She's shown in a shell, as according to Greek mythology, Aphrodite, the Greek name for Venus, was born from the foam of the sea, which was created from the severed genitals of the Titan Uranus, who had been castrated by his son Kronos. And these large-scale depictions of subjects from classical mythology were previously virtually unknown in medieval art, as was a nude female figure of this size and prominence. It was incidentally painted a few years before Fra Savonarola was assigned to Florence in 1490, and he preached against what he regarded as artistic excesses, and by 1495 he had many followers and would host a regular bonfire of the vanities on which he would burn irreplaceable manuscripts, ancient sculptures, modern paintings, musical instruments and so on. And it's said that Botticelli burnt several of his paintings, although the evidence for that isn't clear. Then in 1498 the church condemned Savonarola and burnt him at the stake in the main square in Florence. This is one of the ancient classical statues, a Venus Pudica as it's called, which is one of the inspirations or influences on the figure we see in Botticelli's work. This is Giovanni Bellini's Madonna of the Meadow, produced in about 1500. Now, when I was at school, many years ago, our art teacher would show us famous works of art, and this is one of the few I remember after all those years. Giovanni Bellini was born into the leading family of artists in Venice. His father, Jacopo Bellini, was a famous and innovative artist with a big workshop, and Giovanni went on to revolutionise Venetian painting. Giorgione and Titian were his apprentices. And this work shows Jesus sleeping in the Virgin's lap, a natural pose which anticipates the Pietà, in which the dead body of Christ is laid across his mother's lap. The landscape shows farmland, fortified hills, and to the left is a wading bird, possibly a crane attacking a snake. That, of course, is symbolic of the struggle of good and evil. And the vulture in the tree may be symbolic of death. And a divine light fills the painting with an emphasis on the natural landscape. It's, I think, a reflection of the teachings of the Franciscans, who taught that all nature is sacred. And notice the way that although mother and child are in the landscape, they're separated from the landscape rather than being part of it. Leonardo da Vinci, The Last Supper. The period that I've been covering from the 1490s to 1527 was, and still is, known as the High Renaissance. And it was the time of the great masters, Leonardo, Michelangelo and Raphael. And this is one of Leonardo's best known works. It's in the convent of Santa Maria della Grazia, and it represents the moment during the Last Supper when Jesus announces that one of them will betray him. So what you see here is the shock and disbelief of the disciples, who are asking who, and discussing it amongst themselves as to who it might be. It was commissioned by Ludovico Sforza, who was Duke of Milan, and it's part of the renovation of the church and its buildings. It was unfortunately a technical failure. Leonardo was always experimenting, and he used a novel technique for painting, and so it's deteriorated to the extent that very little of the original work remains, despite many attempts at restoration. Now, normally a fresco is painted on a plaster wall in daily sections. So it's painted, the plaster is put on and then painted into the wet plaster that dries that day. So the pigment soaks in and becomes embedded in the plaster, which then dries. And so it has a long, in dry conditions, a very long life. It's like stone, it's set in stone. However, this method, you have to paint in the day. You can't make changes. And so Leonardo decided, because that didn't suit his style, to use a new technique where he would paint in oil paints. He sealed the wood first, but the damp came through and the paint started to flake away. Incidentally, that area beneath Jesus, he originally had feet like the other disciples, but a door was knocked through in 1652. But luckily there was a copy made of the original. This is perhaps the most famous work of the Renaissance, the Mona Lisa, or the Gioconda by Leonardo da Vinci. It's been written about so often it probably needs a talk on its own. However, I'll keep it short today. Some people actually think it's a self-portrait of Leonardo, but it's been definitively identified as Lisa del Giocondo, whose maiden name was Gerardini, an Italian noblewoman born in 1479, lived in Florence. Her husband was Francesco del Giocondo, he was a rich silk merchant, and he asked Leonardo to paint a portrait around about 1503, but that portrait was never finished, and so it was never given to the silk merchant, and Leonardo took it with him, carried it around with him. In Italy, it's known as La Gioconda, from her married name. And it's one of the things that's well known about it is the subtle smile, the corners of her mouth and eyes. Leonardo is using a painting technique called sfumato, which makes her expression ambiguous. Although down the centuries it's always been considered a masterpiece, it didn't achieve its international, its worldwide and lasting fame until it was stolen in 1911. And that it was talked about in the press around the world. It was returned 2 years later and the world breathed a sigh of relief. And from that point on, it's become and remains, in a sense, the world's most treasured painting. Very difficult to form any sort of relationship with the painting if you visit the Louvre because of the crowds. Incidentally, when it was stolen, police suspected many people, including the poet Guillaume Apollinaire and the artist Pablo Picasso, as they had been involved in buying stolen art from the Louvre previously, but they weren't involved in stealing the Mona Lisa. It was in fact stolen by an Italian petty criminal who worked as a handyman in the Louvre, and when he tried to sell it 2 years later to an art dealer in Florence, the dealer called the police, and that's how it made its way back to the Louvre. The painting is believed to be unfinished, and there's some evidence that Leonardo became partly paralysed in 1517 and therefore couldn't finish it. The lack of eyebrows, incidentally, is not evidence it's unfinished. as careful examination has shown she did have eyebrows, but the pigment used has faded over the years. There are, incidentally, many excellent copies of this painting around the world, including one you might have seen in the Prado in Madrid. I thought I'd show you one more Leonardo, in this case because it's one of my favourites. It's the Virgin and Child with St Anne and St John the Baptist, known as the Burlington House cartoon. It's a drawing in charcoal and black and white chalk on tinted paper in the National Gallery in London. A bit of background: in 1499, the French army overthrew Ludovico Sforza, who I mentioned, the Duke of Milan, and Leonardo fled Milan for Venice, where he worked on military defences to defend against naval attack. And that same year he continued on to Florence, where a monastery provided him with a workshop, and that's where he created this cartoon of the Virgin and Child. And the work won such admiration that, quotes, men and women, young and old, flocked to see it as if they were attending a great festival. It's also known as the Burlington House cartoon because that's where it was once situated, Burlington House. But it's never been used as a cartoon. If it had been, there would have been pinpricks all over it, which it doesn't have. And there's no known painting by Leonardo based on this cartoon. So it was either executed in and around 1499 to 1500, or at the end of his period when he was in Milan, that is, or around 1506 to 1508 when he was travelling between Florence and Milan. Many, if not most, scholars prefer the latter date, although the National Gallery prefers the former, so I've simply shown a wide range of dates here. It was, in 1962, it was put on sale for £800,000, and 250,000 people saw it in the 4 months that it was being displayed, and enough money was raised from donations and the National Art Collection Fund to purchase it for the United Kingdom. In my opinion, it's one of the greatest works of art in the country. I just ask you to sit in front of it for 10 minutes. This is obviously Michelangelo's David. Michelangelo di Ludovico Buonarroti Simoni, known as Michelangelo, was a sculptor, painter, architect and poet, born in Florence. And in fact, this statue was begun before he was born. So how does that work? A sculptor called Agostini di Duccio was commissioned to produce a statue of David, and he did some rough carvings of the legs and some drapery, but stopped. We don't know why. And then later, another sculptor, Antonio Rossellino, was commissioned to complete the work, but his contract was terminated, and we don't know why. But he did some further work on the statue, but left it as a block of marble lying flat on its back, and it remained untouched like that for 26 years in the open. So it was exposed to the element, and it became just an enormous mess. Now, something had to be done because such a large block of marble was costly, and so it couldn't be thrown away. But what could they do with it? Well, they first of all lifted it upright, and various experts examined it and were consulted, including Leonardo da Vinci. But it was Michelangelo, who was only 26 years old at the time, convinced the owners of the marble that he could complete the work despite the mess it was in. And in 1501 he was given the official contract to undertake this extremely challenging task, and he started a month later. It took him about 2 years, and he finished in 1504, and the work established him as the leading sculptor in Florence. There was further controversy then, after he'd finished it, about where to put it. They set up a team of consultants, including Botticelli and Leonardo, and these experts, we have the transcripts still of the meeting, so we know exactly what they said. Leonardo, for example, said the statue needed decent ornament. In other words, some type of covering over the genitals, a fig leaf, in other words. And following much argument over 9 different locations, it was placed outside the Palazzo Vecchio. It was then called the Palazzo della Signoria, with a gilded fig leaf attached over his genitals, and the sling and the tree stump were gilded. Then, much later, in the mid-19th century, they noticed cracks in the legs, and it was moved to the Accademia Gallery, which is where it now is, and replaced by a copy. In 1991, it was attacked by a deranged artist with a hammer, and 3 tourists, believe it or not, tried to escape the gallery with the fragments, but luckily the guards saw what was happening and stopped them, and so all the original pieces were obtained and have been restored. Now, the cracks in the statue have been analysed and were probably caused by a flood in 1844 that caused the base to tilt slightly, throwing the 8.5 tons forward. And so now the statue is being very carefully monitored by high-resolution 3D scanning. But we now come to one of Michelangelo's greatest achievements, considered by his fellow artists at the time to be impossible: the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Now, the chapel itself, the Sistine Chapel, had been built some 30 years before. The walls, as you can see, had been painted by many leading artists, including Sandro Botticelli, Pietro Perugino, and Raphael also designed a set of tapestries to cover the lowest level, and they're not permanently in place. They're hung today on special occasions. Now, the ceiling was originally painted with stars on a blue background, and in 1505 Pope Julius II decided to repaint the ceiling and ordered Michelangelo to leave Florence and come to Rome to paint it. Now, both Michelangelo and the Pope both had fiery tempers, and they quickly argued about the commission. In fact, Michelangelo didn't want to paint the ceiling, as he'd never undertaken such a large fresco project before. However, Bramante persuaded the Pope to insist. We think because Bramante thought the project was impossible and wanted Michelangelo to fail and be disgraced. So Michelangelo then returned to Florence. Some said he fled. But the Pope pressured the government there in Florence to get him to return, because no one wanted to upset the Pope. So eventually he returned to Rome and agreed to paint the ceiling. But then they couldn't agree on the scenes to be included, and the Pope decided to give Michelangelo a free hand. And Michelangelo came up with this extremely complex scheme representing the creation, the fall of man, the promise of salvation through the prophets, and the genealogy of Christ. Now, Bramante built some scaffolding, but Michelangelo rejected it and had his own built. And we know from a sketch and a poem by Michelangelo that he painted the ceiling standing with his head tilted up and his arm raised above his head. I can't understand how anyone could work that way day in, day out for months without their neck seizing up. He started with this, the drunkenness of Noah, and it shows the humiliation of the drunken Noah, which was seen as a prefiguration of the humiliation of Christ. The inudi, that is naked figures around the picture, one of them on the bottom right was damaged by a gunpowder explosion at the Castel San Angelico in 1797. Now, Michelangelo worked backwards across the ceiling and ended with this work, The Creation of Eve, in the centre, which he finished in 1510. And then the first half of the ceiling was unveiled in August 1511. The second half was delayed to build new scaffolding, and then proceeded quickly, and he finished it by the 31st of October 1512. And this is the final scheme, including over 300 figures, and you can see the drunkenness of Noah here over on the left, and you can see the creation of Eve here in the centre. When it was unveiled, the sight of it left people amazed and speechless, and from then on Michelangelo, for the rest of his life, was regarded as the greatest artist of his time, and the Sistine Chapel ceiling as the greatest masterpiece of all time, a view I think that continues to this day. The most famous section are probably those either side of the centre. The creation of Adam. God is depicted as an elderly man, Adam shown naked, holding out his hand to receive the spark of life. The two fingers are separated by a gap of 2 centimetres, which some think signifies the unattainability by man of divine perfection. And it has been pointed out, I don't know whether this is going too far, but the red cloth around God has the shape of a human uterus, and the green scarf like a cut umbilical cord, and this heavenly birth explains why Adam is shown here with a navel. The other famous section is the fall and expulsion from paradise. Adam and Eve are taking, on the left, fruit from the forbidden tree, which here is shown as a fig tree rather than the traditional apple tree. Eve is trustingly taking it from the hand of the serpent, which is depicted as Lilith. Now, Lilith was the first woman created by God according to ancient Jewish tradition, and Adam is already eagerly picking another fruit for himself. On the right is their banishment from the Garden of Eden to the world outside, where they have to fend for themselves, work, experience pain and death, and you can see here how they've aged between their figures on the left and on the right of this scene. A final comment. Some people have pointed out, I'm not sure whether I agree that it was intentional, that the tree in the middle and the two figures either side form the letter M, and that this is Michelangelo's signature. A nice point. Raphael. This is the school of Athens. Now, Raphael in 1508 was called by Pope Julius II to decorate the papal apartments in the Vatican. And this commission launched Raphael's most productive and influential phase of his career. The School of Athens is in the Stanza della Segnatura, and he painted it between 1509 and 1511. The fresco shows a gathering of ancient Greek philosophers, scientists and mathematicians. At the centre are Plato and Aristotle, surrounded by other notable figures like Pythagoras, Euclid, Ptolemy. It's a masterpiece of perspective and composition. The architecture and figures are carefully arranged and balanced to create this sense of depth and grandeur, and his use of colour and light adds to the overall harmony and balance. The architectural setting is believed to be inspired by Bramante's new designs for St. Peter's Basilica, which was being constructed at the time. And Raphael included portraits of his contemporaries. I'll just point out a few of them. Plato in the centre is Leonardo da Vinci. Michelangelo towards the front as Heraclitus. Over on the right there is a self-portrait of Raphael depicting himself as the ancient Greek painter Apelles. And a final figure to point out, there are many, is an anachronism. This figure here is Averroes, a 12th century Islamic philosopher who's shown anachronistically amongst the ancient Greek thinkers. We now come to Titian and the Venetian style, which emphasise colour rather than drawing. And at this point, I should probably explain the distinction, which was a fundamental tension in Renaissance art theory. And these tensions, there were others, were known as paragone. And in this case, the paragone, the tension is between the importance of disegno, drawing, which was favoured by Florentine artists, and emphasised the importance of drawing and pre-drawing and line and the intellectual conception of painting. And colorituro, colouring, which was preferred by Venetian artists who focused on the use of colour directly applied to the canvas with a strong emphasis on emotion and feeling. And typically they painted without any underdrawing. They just painted directly onto the canvas. This enormous painting, The Assumption of the Virgin, nearly 7 metres high, marked a new direction in his style and a new awareness, a new development of high Renaissance. The painting was criticised by some at the time because of the agitated figures of the apostle down below. It shocked some people. They were described as quarrelling conspirators. Another criticism of the painting at the time is the Virgin Mary, rather than being shown typically as meek and timid, she's shown as a mature and powerful woman. So various breaks with tradition, but overall it was regarded as his masterpiece, following on in the tradition of Giovanni Bellini and others. Now Titian, his real name is Tiziano Vecellio, and it was Latinized Titianus, and therefore in English simplified to Titian, was actually born in Pieve di Cadore, and during his lifetime he was usually called de Cadore, from Cadore. He was recognised as a genius. In fact, he was called by his contemporaries the sun amidst small stars, recalling the final line of Dante's Paradiso, which reads, "By the love that moves the sun and the other stars." And the other stars, which I'll show you in a moment, were the artists Tintoretto and Veronese. Just showing you this because I said it's an enormous painting, 7 metres high, but you've got to remember it's an enormous church. The Basilica di Santa Maria Glorioso de Frari, the Frari, is a very big church, and it's situated at the back behind the altar. And so even from the front, I took this photograph from the front of the pews, and you can see that the painting, although it's so large, is in keeping with the size of the basilica. one other painting by Titian. This is Bacchus and Ariadne in the National Gallery, one of the most famous paintings in the National Gallery. It's telling a story which was first told by Ovid and also by Catullus. The Cretan princess Ariadne has just been abandoned on the Greek island of Naxos by Theseus, and we can see his ship sailing away in the distance, just to the left of her shoulder. And Bacchus, the god of wine, has just arrived. Leaping from his chariot, he falls in love at first sight with Ariadne, and later Bacchus throws Ariadne's crown into the air, immortalising her as the constellation Corona Borealis, sometimes called the Northern Crown, and you can see that right up in the sky above her head. Now, this painting was one of a series including paintings by Giovanni Bellini and Dosso Dossi, as well as Titian, and they were commissioned for the Alabaster Room in the Ducal Palace at Ferrara by Alfonso d'Este. All the pictures were completed between 1514 and 1525. They're all bacchanales, that is, scenes of hedonism, drinking, music making and love making. And Titian here shows off his great skill as a colourist, and he's combined in this single picture all of the purest and most vibrant pigments available at the time. His chariot is drawn by two cheetahs, probably modelled on those in the Duke's menagerie, because in Ovid's story they're described as tigers. So this quirky change was probably inspired by the Duke's personal menagerie, which did include a cheetah but not a tiger. So it's amusing to imagine Titian convincing the Duke to let him use his exotic pets as models. And then another pet. In the foreground of the painting, there's a small cocker spaniel barking at the divine procession. The little dog, probably representing the human side of the scene, seems unimpressed by the god who's just arrived, and the dog adds a touch of humour. We know that the cocker spaniel was a motif that Titian used in other paintings, and it was probably a court pet. And we also know that the dog wasn't part of the original composition, that Titian added it as a final touch, possibly at the request of Alfonso d'Este, his patron. And then one final point about this painting, the signature vase. Let me enlarge it. You can see that Titian has included his signature on a bronze vase in the foreground, engraving it as if it were an ancient artifact. So this clever placement of his brand in the painting is a witty artistic flourish and a sly way of immortalising himself alongside these mythological figures. This is Francesco Mazzola, better known as Parmigiano, Madonna with the long neck. Remember I said the High Renaissance ended in 1527. You might have wondered why such a precise date. It was 1527 that Rome was sacked by the uncontrolled troops of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the troops who'd been unpaid, which is probably why they then looted and killed without restraint across Rome, until the following year the plague visited Rome, which drove the troops away to Naples, leaving Rome reduced from 55,000 people to just 10,000. And that date, that significant date, is taken as the end of the High Renaissance and the beginning of the Late Renaissance. And part of the Late Renaissance is mannerism, which eventually led to the Baroque. And a key painting in the mannerist distortion and elongation is this work by Parmigianino, and it shows the deliberate break from High Renaissance and its refined, balanced works. And this painting is the one that's typically used to exemplify the mannerist style. Note the elongated neck, the exaggerated proportions, the twisted poses, all features of the mannerist style. What we see here is the Virgin with an elongated neck, which could be a reference to a line from a hymn at the time about the purity of the Virgin, which includes the line, "Your neck is like a column." Now, Parmigianino was born in Parma. He was influenced by the work of Raphael and Michelangelo, but he exaggerated poses and colours, and this became a hallmark of mannerism, and it gives this sort of otherworldly quality to the scene. So the works, the mannerist works, create this tension between naturalism, beauty, and the spiritual. So the works have become more of a spiritual form of beauty rather than a human beauty. Let me show you mannerism in Venice. Now, unlike mannerism in Florence and Rome, Venetian mannerism was characterized by this sort of dynamic diagonal compositions, dramatic lighting, which you see here, spatial effects, intense colour contrast, complex crowded scenes, and this theatrical staging of religious and mythological subjects. And we see all those features in this painting by Tintoretto, Jacopo Tintoretto. He was an extremely intelligent, fiercely ambitious artist, rarely travelled outside Venice. And his biographer wrote, he was always thinking of ways to make himself known as the most daring painter in the world. He was described as an agreeable companion, but he always kept his working methods secret, even to his close friends. It was said he was full of pleasant, witty sayings, but hardly ever smiled. But by 1592, when he painted this, he was widely recognised as one of Venice's greatest painters. He'd completed by that time numerous commissions for churches, confraternities, and the Venetian state. Now, the commission for this work came from the Benedictine monks of San Giorgio Maggiore, who were renovating their church under the direction of the architect Andrea Palladio. And this work is a masterpiece of his late style, of Tintoretto's late style. The dramatic use of light, perspective, and unconventional composition are all features of his late work. Notice the way he's placed the table diagonally across the canvas, creating this sense of depth and movement, and the figures of Christ and the apostles are pushed to the background almost, while servants and everyday objects occupy the foreground. An innovative composition which creates a sense of spiritual and physical drama typical of his work. Note the supernatural elements that he's included, that is the translucent angels top right swirling around the room, which add this mystical and spiritual dimension. The other great Venetian artist is Paolo Veronese. This work was completed in 1563. It's the Wedding at Cana, and it's one of his most famous and ambitious works. It was commissioned by Benedictine monks in San Giorgio Maggiore, and it's a massive canvas. I think the largest painted canvas in the Renaissance period. It's nearly 10 metres wide and weighs 1.5 tons and was intended for the refectory of the monastery. It shows a biblical story, Jesus turning water into wine at a wedding feast. but Veronese has transformed it into a grand Venetian banquet set in this magnificent architectural setting, reflecting the splendour of 16th century Venice. It's populated by over 130 figures, and there are portraits of many contemporary figures, including Titian, Tintoretto, a self-portrait of Veronese himself, playing music in the foreground, but many other well-known figures of the period. The painting itself was seized by Napoleon and cut into sections for transport when his troops seized it in 1797. It was then reassembled in Paris, but some damage from this process is still visible. It was never returned, which is why it's still now in the Louvre, I think the largest painting in the Louvre. And Veronese's contract specified he must use the highest quality pigments, which is why he used the expensive lapis lazuli for the blues, and that means that the pigments, the colours, were fast, and it contributes to the painting's vibrant and enduring colours. And then the last painting I wanted to end with is by Giorgio Vasari, and for two reasons I wanted to end for this. The first is that it shows 6 Tuscan poets, and I've been emphasising the art of the Renaissance period, but we mustn't forget this was a time when all of the arts developed, and what Vasari has done here is he's documented the famous literary figures that helped define the Renaissance. We see, I've got some labels I'll put on. All the figures in the painting are well-known artists of the period, but I'll just talk about 3. First of all, Dante Alighieri, one of the most celebrated poets of the age, in fact of all time, and the author of the Divine Comedy. He's sitting most prominently in the painting. To the left stands Francesco Petrarch, and Petrarch is holding a green volume, and on the cover you can see there's a cameo portrait of a woman in profile, likely meant to be Petrarch's muse Laura. And behind them is Giovanni Boccaccio, who's the author of the Decameron, a book which was begun in 1348 following the outbreak of the Black Death in Florence. And then I'd just like to draw your attention to the objects on the table, because they represent various scholarly disciplines, and they therefore foresee the forthcoming scientific revolution that would fundamentally change the world in the coming centuries. On the table there's a solar quadrant, a celestial globe denoting astronomy and astrology, the compass and terrestrial globe, geometry and geography, and the books, grammar and rhetoric. And as a final point, and another reason I included this work by Vasari, is of course Vasari was the first art historian, and it was Vasari that documented the lives of all the famous Italian Renaissance artists in his work, The Lives of the Artist, which is why we know so much about them today. So thank you, Vasari. Now, the Renaissance is generally considered to end around 1600 and gave way to the Baroque and the beginnings of the scientific revolution. So that ends my short talk, a bit longer than normal. Introduction to the Renaissance, which together with ancient Greek art is perhaps the most influential period in the history of Western art. And this talk is followed by many other talks about the individual Renaissance artists that I've mentioned. So that brings me to the end of this introduction. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to recording another talk for you.